Been a while, but I still need to talk about spells some more. I'm just going to compress a lot of them into one video, and here it is. So, I want to talk about what the best spells are in the game, the ones that you should really look at for picking on your low-ish level characters, and I'm particularly going to be evaluating them for drop-and-play games such as my home, ETT. So, this is our remaster doc for our recent rules rework because the old document was a mess. Now it's completely good to join. And it's a good spot to learn the game with other people that know the game, other GMs that know the game. And if you want to try running game, low pressure environment. Alright, well, that's my plug out of the way. And now, let's talk about what makes something good in ETT specifically. So, in ETT or Pathfinder Society or any of those things where you're just dropping and playing with a random group, you have no real control over what your build's playing with. You don't really have that much knowledge going into what the mission's going to be about. And then there will probably be some hard combats. And that's really all you have to judge something. And there will usually be quite a few combats in Adventuring Day. It's really not a lot of things to go off of. So that means if a spell relies on party members being specific, relies on specific types of enemies, it's going to get heavily docked down in my evaluations. But I have some spells that I'm really happy with that I want to present to all of you. So that way you know which ones I think are good, and maybe you'll learn something about how to evaluate spells yourself, so that way when new things come out or things get reworked and remaster and that book over there becomes a little bit less relevant, you'll be set out to dry and you can know, okay, these are the things that are good. So, with that, I'm going to give a quick example of what I mean by things that don't rely on party comp. Because there's a decently good spell in the game, known as Agitate. And Agitate, by default, it basically says, you, this enemy, make a choice. You will either need to stride on your turn, or take a pretty significant amount of damage. Now, let's say you're just fighting a single enemy. That is a melee creature and you're the spellcaster, alright? And this is a situation. So you cast Agitate on the bad guy, and let's say they fail their save. So, massive high-level Agitate. You're gonna go boom. But actually, they're not taking any damage. You just put the Agitate on them, and then they're gonna say, okay, I was gonna move anyway. And then you die. So, Agitate by default is a spell that doesn't really do a whole lot, unless you have specific situations. And a very good example of a specific situation is if you have a fighter standing next to them. Because with a fighter standing next to them, now, if they move, there's an attack of opportunity. So now they really don't want to move, so they might willingly choose to take that damage, and now it's a really, really efficient damage spell. But you still can't rely on that fighter existing in a normal society or ETT game. So if you're something like a spontaneous caster, it's probably not a good idea to take spells like that. But if you're a prepared caster, definitely keep note of spells like that. That if you see a party with a variety of fighters that stop movement, you can then take the spells that force enemies to move. So there are a lot of cross synergies, but I'm not really going to be getting into those because those are very complicated, and they quickly get balloons out of hand. So with that, let's start the list. Oh, and I should mention, if you want me to go into detail on those more situational spells, leave a comment down below because I might make a video about those. And here at number 10, we have Longstrider. And Longstrider is here for a very specific reason, and it's that upcast duration of 8 hours. But first, let's go over what the spell does. So for 2 actions that you're never going to use in combat, you get to get a plus 10 status bonus to move speed, which seems insignificant at first glance. Because after all, what's 10 feet? Then you really start to think about it, and there aren't a whole lot of ways to gain status bonus to move speed other than like temporary consumable items. But if you have Longstrider, you can then put into a wand, and no matter what your build is, no matter what your party comp is, this is going to be one of the most efficient ways to get move speed on any given character. And that alone puts on this list at number 10. Oh, and side note on Longstrider, I actually managed to abuse this so hard in one of Ronald's games that he has now banned it in all of his paid games. Because, you can definitely exploit this one if you start, buying all those wands with a new character money starting at a high level, and then start passing them out to your allies. It's a very good argument for modifying the spell, or possibly changing it, but honestly, it's not that big of a deal, even if you consider it to be very, very powerful. So, there you go. So again, at number 9, we're going to have another pretty basic one. We have the spell Light. And Light is a pretty often overlooked cantrip, as it's just like, yeah, whatever, who cares? But it has a lot of tricks to it that I don't think are immediately apparent to a lot of people learning this game for the first time. For example, it normally just has an object glow. Making that object glow does not consume a hand, where all the other ways to transport light around a dungeon usually take up a hand or have some other kind of thing you need to deal with, whether that be a cone or whatever. This just lets you have an aura on any item, you don't need to worry about it, you just touch something and that is glowing. You can put on a piece of ammunition and then shoot it forward to see further down a dark hallway. So there's a lot of things you can do with light, and if you're in a group where you don't really know your party members, one of you is not going to have dark vision, and this will become the best spell in the game. Also, a side note, and this is something I know a lot of advanced players don't even know, if you go into the light trait, it actually has this funny little thing, if I zoom in so it goes below my face cam, can counteract magical darkness just in the trait itself. So you, instead of casting light targeting like a normal object, you would then use it to target the darkness itself, and then you can try and cancel out the darkness entirely by using counteract rules. And I don't know, I just think that's a little interesting, and probably worth mentioning. Now at number 8, we have another very basic low-level spell, and that is True Strike. And True Strike has a lot of interesting stuff with it, like you can see how many deities give this as a level 1 spell, and that's actually something pretty important to note if you're a War Priest type cleric for some feats that I might get into later on if I make a War Priest guide, which I might, leave in comments down below if you want to see it. But the gist of this spell is it's one action to give you 5 advantage, roll 2 dice, take the biggest, on your next attack. Not strike, despite strike being in the name, so this works with spell attack rolls. So you can do this alongside any of your big spell attacks, or along with big activities like a Magus Spell Strike. So if you are a caster that has attack spells, either for cantrip damage variety, or something more like an attack spell that disintegrate, or anything along those lines, this will be one that you definitely want to have an eye on as you start going higher levels, and your lower level slots start to become way more expendable, because this is a great way to start spending those slots to get a lot of power out of them. Now for number 7, we have a even more basic spell. It does exactly what it says on the tin. Airwalk. It's basically a better fly spell. Because, normally a fly spell would have you go through all these rigmaroles to do things like turn around midair, stop, fly still, and it requires you to keep on maintaining the fact that you're flying. This just lets a creature ignore a lot of those requirements and just exist in the air, which is really, really valuable, particularly at high levels when you start to get access to a lot of activities that take more and more actions. So this is a very, class-neutral way to have flight be very useful, even if you want to spend all 3 actions, like if you're something like a bard, or any other class that might want you to spend a lot of actions doing something, and then has a lot of very powerful things to do with that 3rd action, because most spells are 2 actions, so if you have stuff you want to do with that 3rd that isn't just fly and maintain that flight, looking for sources of airwalk rather than fly can be very impactful, and this is a distinction that not many people would realize until they start really digging into these spells, and that's why I want to get into with this list. It's a lot of things that people might gloss over when reading through spells rather than doing a lot of the more thorough stuff. Alright, so for number 6, we have Hideous Laughter, and I have a very specific reason for getting this, because, I really didn't have a lot of spells that required a certain type of encounter until this point, because I think that in order to be considered one of the best spells in the game, you should be generally useful. But this is one of the few spells where I'm going to make an exception to that because it's just so potent at shutting down a specific type of creature, because of its success effect. The target is plagued with uncontrollable laughter. It can't use reactions. Shutting down reactions can completely nullify a wide variety of creatures, particularly the more brawlery, bruisery ones, because that's where you start to get things like the Hydra. which I'm just going to pull up on the screen now, because it has this funny thing where it has an X reaction per each of its heads beyond the first, and you can see in the art there's 5 heads by default, so yeah, shutting down all 5 reactions with a single spell on a successful save, targeting its worst save. That is absurd, and a lot of creatures that are more brute-like tend to have a pretty potent reaction, whether it's attack of opportunity or something else, and this can shut them down hard. Same thing goes with the soldiers, but they tend to have slightly higher will saves depending on the exact stat block. But if the GM is using a more bossy type martial monster, which is decently common in a lot of adventures, this completely nullifies them as a second level spell that you do not need to upcast, because this one doesn't have the incapacitation trait. And this is something that somebody might overlook very hard. And because it is a second level spell, it's very easy to slot this in on a caster that's starting to lose some use of their second level slots, because they're getting too high level. And, of course, its failure and critical failure effects are also really, really good. But, you know, they aren't really why I think the spell is great, and it's shutting down reactions. That is such a big deal, and something that's very hard to come by. Because normally if you have a creature with attack of opportunity, you just need to figure out who's eating it. This just lets you effectively pre-heal all of those attacks of opportunity. It's great. Love it. Alright, and here for number 5, we have Soothe. This is only for the occult casters among us. I'm not taking another take. Anyway, it's basically just a range 30 feet, 10 d10 plus 4 hit points, that also gives a +2 bonus against mental saves for the duration of 1 minute. Now, this at first seems like a slightly worse heal, because it is, but this +2 status bonus against mental effects is basically +2 to will saves, like, effectively. Because a lot of the things that target the will save are mental effects. So it's very hard to target the mental of a mindless creature. This basically increases your will save up by like 1 training tier by itself for a minute, which is entire combat. Which is very, very relevant in the scenarios, so do not forget that this is on Soothe. And as you're upcasting and it keeps on getting high more and more and more, like the higher level Soothes at level 5 spell, it's going to be dealing 5d10 plus 20, which can really burst heal somebody from like a third to maybe near full, which is a lot. And make sure you use your healing spells before people go down so that they aren't wasting actions standing back up, picking up their weapons, moving initiative, and all that stuff. This is a good one to heal on somebody, and then that keeps them being able to resist stuff for the rest of the fight. Very potent. Here, we have another spell at number 4 that is very good at being a low-level spell for high-level casters, and that is Fear. Fear is available to all casters of all spell lists, even the elemental ones if you're taking that archetype. And it usually targets 1 creature and friends them based on the degree of success of their save. At reasonably worst, they're just normal succeed and they're still friend 1, which is still something. That still lowers your next tax. It's not great, but it becomes pretty good at the failure and critical failure margins. That's when it becomes really, really excellent. And when you hide in it, it can target to 5 guys. And targeting to 5 people that don't need to share a language, or 5 minor creatures, this can basically make it so that mooks cannot hit you at all. And when you're doing this, some of them are crit failing, you can really break up ranks very, very easily with these hide versions of these spells that get more targets. That's an extremely potent thing you should look for in a lot of spells, is if it can get more targets on a Haydn, it's usually pretty absurd when you do Haydn. But all things that I would say here are about the fear condition now. +1s matter, which I can make a video on later, but I have a feeling that a lot of the people that are finding my channel have already heard Ron talk endlessly about how much +1s matter. So I'm not going to reiterate that here too much, but I'm just going to say that a +1 is a bonus to hit and a bonus to crit. So it's about twice as much as what you would expect coming from 5e. So keep that in mind as you start reading. That's a -3 to everything on the crit fail. Advantage is only 3.75 plus on average. Keep that in mind. As we move on to our next spell. And At number 3 is where we start to get into spells that I think might pose minor balance issues for the game as a whole, because they can nullify so much or outclass so much of the other parts of the game. But I don't really think they're big enough issues that we should do something about them as a community. I just think it's something that you should be aware of, and I'm talking about slow. Now, people have played Pathfinder a lot, and have played Pathfinder particularly at the upper levels, will tell you how good this spell is. Because its primary use is, as a 3rd level spell, you cast it on the boss, and then, if they fail, they're slowed 1 for a minute. So now that boss is playing with 2 actions instead of 3. That cuts their action economy down by minus 33%. Mind you, the first attack is still the scariest, but it cuts down one of their actions you can use to move. Suddenly they're much more kiteable. And if you have somebody else doing hideous laughter to cut out their reactions, suddenly they're half a stat block from 2 spells. And the same caster can have both these spells, because both those are on both the arcane and occult lists. So if you're a bard, you could just eliminate somebody from an encounter if they fail a couple saves. That's the type of power that's contained in the slow spell. And if they crit fail, they might as well be removed from the fight. They have 1 action per round, just kite them. Just kite them. You just hit them and walk away. They need to spend action to walk over to you. Oh, they have no actions left. Kite them. They can't do anything about it. Just kite them. Do it. Anyway. But it also heightens. You remember how I talked about with Fear, how heightening spells can become an issue if they start getting more targets? Well, imagine this. I said can, nullify a lot of boss monsters with 10 targets. It didn't need this to be valid at high levels. It just didn't. But, now that it's here, I'm going to say thank you very much, Mr. Paizo Man. I will definitely start using this one. For number 2, I had to move my webcam again because I just want you to see all of this spell. So, this is Electric Arc. Now, some of you may know this spell as the highest damage cantrip in the game. Others of you have not played that much Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So, as I said, this is the highest damage cantrip in the game, but you might say, but it's only 1d4 plus spellcasting ability modifier. That's not that much. There are some cantrips that do 1d6, like Telekinetic Projectile, or Gouging Claw. What about those? And well, the answer is, it can't target 2 creatures. Those do not do half damage on a successful save. Though, and the other ones that have high damage don't heighten every single level. This cantrip is something that makes Primal and Arcane casters still do above tier damage for other casters, because that's part of their identity with the World Essence. See my video on different types of casting if you want to know more about that. But this is what makes Arcane Primal casters really set apart in the early game, is that they have access to this spell. And all the other elemental damage cantrips, so mostly Electric Arc is the one that people can point to and say, that is the thing that puts Wizard Druid on the map. If you take away Electric Arc, you're taking a lot of early power out of the Wizard and Druid. And Electric Arc falls off with a lot of cantrips later on in the game, because plus spellcasting ability modifier falls off faster than plus 2d6 per spell level does, because this just does not scale at the same rate as something like Fireball would. And when you start having a lot of expendable slots, start using things like Fireball, cantrips start to become less meaningful in a lot of ways. But, oh boy, early game. Early game Electric Arcs are sweet. Highly recommend. And also, another funny trick is, because of how this spell is worded, this range of 30 feet, the targets don't need to be within 30 feet of each other. It just says pick 2 targets within 30 feet of you. Because there are some spells like Chain Lightning that are worded about bouncing from creature to creature. This just says pick 2 and damage both. Now this means Reach Spell makes it 60-foot range to damage both creatures. Now, let me start the honorable mention list before I get to number 1. I know a lot of people would expect Magic Weapon to be at number 1, but I don't buy into a lot of the hype around the spell, because, you see, it has a few fundamental issues, and I'm just going to go over what those issues are now so that you can understand why I did not put this on the top 10 list. And the first one is, touch one weapon that is unattended, wielded by you or a willing ally. So, you're touching one weapon. So that means if your party has reliance on dual wielders for its strikers, or is very spellcaster heavy, or a very weird party comp that you can see in ETT or these other things, you may have no good targets for the spell, which already has docked a few points, but like, it's pretty reasonable to have somebody that's a good target for a magic weapon, because I mean like, who doesn't like an extra damage die? Well, it depends, because if you're early game, you maybe are fighting things like Goblin Warriors, and the thing about Goblin Warriors is, their HP pool is, the 2d12 plus 4 seems like a lot of overkill, a lot of wasted damage, and that's 2 actions you could have used to use Electric Arc, and possibly put some of these goblins in the dirt. But now that goblin's done damage, and you spent a spell slot to let a goblin do damage. Interesting. So, every buff spell needs to be evaluated by also the tempo you are losing by setting up the buff spell instead of doing front-loaded damage to get enemies out of initiative order. And that's another thing one needs to consider as a caster. But, okay, let's now go into the actual spell. The target weapon becomes a +1 striking weapon. Really ridiculous. If you're in a boss fight, this is the highest damage spell the low level character has access to. Period. It just is. If you have a great sword character in your party, as a low level party and you're worried about a boss fight, throw a magic weapon on them, you no longer need to worry about the boss fight. They die. That's it. I should mention that magic weapon is more relevant on classes that boost accuracy, or have action economy cheats, such as the monk or the fighter, because it's not as much for percent gain in damage for a giant instinct barbarian to be magic weaponed, because they're already dealing a d12 plus 10. So they're doing an average 16.5 damage, where if you were to magic weapon them, well, now they're going to be doing a hefty 23 damage, but that isn't that big of a deal compared to the fighter, which is going from 10.5 to 17. That difference matters a lot more for the fighter with the lower damage numbers. And I think I talked about this in video before with how much damage matters, but it's more party comp dependent than a lot of guides on the internet would have you believe. It's still a great spell, and I'd pick it if I was making a low-level spellcaster. But I put in honorable mentions to kind of give a nod to, I don't think it's as great or as busted as a lot of the community seems to think it is. And another thing on honorable mentions for just my heart is Enlarge. This makes somebody big, makes them clumsy 1, makes them do some bit of extra damage. Again, this is more useful in your things like your fighters and your monks, that can either benefit from the excess reach, like if they have attack of opportunity or a champion reaction that they really want to have like go off more often. It lets them cover more tiles and a bunch of good stuff of that nature. And when hidens, they can become even larger. But there's some interesting tech with Enlarge, like for example, this clumsy 1 doesn't do anything if you're already clumsy, like if you're a giant instinct barbarian. So you just let your giant instinct barbarian have bonus damage with no downside. It's free damage. Not bad. And if they have ways to get that increased reach to mean stuff with swipe, or attacks of opportunity, or other things of that nature, it becomes very good. But again, comp dependent, so I'm not really putting it there. And on the tone of comp dependent, I'm about to make a lot of people very angry. So, I don't think haste is that great in PF2. It's still very good. I just don't think it's as great as people say it is. And the gist of haste is that it gives them quickened for only strike or strike. Now, an optimized martial in PF2 is really never wanting to make basic strike, but it still is a fine option. If they hadn't already attacked twice, if things aren't moving that much. So you tend to use it to like stride into position to then do your turn, and then do your big activities that you normally wouldn't have the action economy for. But if you don't really have characters that are looking to do these big activities, or keep on moving while casting all their spells and striking and doing all this other stuff, it starts to not look all that great to spend 2 actions of a very valuable turn, your first turn, then set up something that might not pay itself back in damage till much, much later, when you could just throw out a front-load damage spell like Fireball and potentially remove something from initiative order. Because that's just like how I tend to play the game, is I like to have impact immediately. And that's just kind of the thing. I'm not going to say that this spell is bad. This spell is great in the right party comp. It's just more comp dependent than I think a lot of people give it credit for. But now, it's time. it is time for the number one. And that spell is Heal. Not joking. Best spell in the game. You can stop watching here if you don't believe me, but, you know, I think you will believe me by the end of this one. Because when I'm GMing, and I want to know if my party can handle another encounter, I just count how many spell slots of Heal the party has, and it's usually pretty accurate. Because Heal is usually, it's just the second mode. Because, like, let's be honest. Spell has a range of 30 feet, really decent range, not great, but decent. And if you're healing a living creature, increase the hit points restored by 8. And that also increases for the hiding as well. So if you're hiding this level 5, it's 5d8 plus 40. Plus 40 is a ridiculous modifier to have. So, why do I think it's number one though? It heals for a good amount, but like, there aren't a whole lot of ways for just marshals to patch themselves back up in the middle of the fight. You have maybe champion lay on hands, maybe somebody's going medic archetype, but that's all composition dependent. And very often what I see in these random pickup games is nobody plays healers. And I'm grading this for pickup games. Nobody plays healers. Play healers. Healing is legitimately a super impactful thing you can do. And honestly, I don't think I've really seen that many people use the one action variant, because you just get so much more slot efficiency with the two action variant. But you could do it if you really need to pick somebody off the ground, and it's nice to have the option there. It's always stronger to have options, even if the options seem weak or overly situational, than to give up options. So just keep it in mind that it's there. But the reaction variant is also situational, but this is a situation I see happen pretty often. And that's, oh, all of us are kind of injured and we're surrounded by a bunch of weak undead. Which thus turns this into a highly efficient damage spell that also heals your allies. I cannot state how absurd that is. Mind you, this only really comes into effect when you're like already partway through a fight. But as a cleric, you're mostly going to be doing like buff spells and then swapping back to healing. Maybe throwing a damage counter per strike every now and again. But the main gist of what you're doing is buffing and then healing as a divine caster. And this is one of the most efficient healing spells in the game, and you get level 1. It's very strong burst healing, very simple, does what you want to, and then also sometimes a big AoE blast. And does not rely on party comp much at all, other than like if you have a bunch of undead running around, but, you know, I think they know it's coming to them. May Pharasma live long. Feel free to like and subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this. I plan on making a lot more videos that are optimization focused for what kinds of things are good in Pathfinder, because that's a niche I don't really see a whole lot of people filling, surprisingly enough. So, with that, I'll see you all in the next one.